think about the conversation that Nicodemus had with Jesus. This is a professor of professors. So if there was any professor, there was no other professor. All right?
As in Nicodemus was the
Nicodemus was like the it
of
that. And so he asks for an audience with Jesus.
So he's a Jewish, maybe for people who might not understand.
Okay.
How would you, in the Jewish culture, who was Nicodemus?
Nicodemus was that like the arch professor of Hebrew theology.
Okay.
All right?
Yeah. So he knows the ins and outs.
Ins and outs.
Yeah.
So he's sitting with Jesus Christ. And he's having this conversation. I tend to think that John didn't capture everything. You know? All right? But what the Holy Spirit allowed John to capture was enough to be able to give us the context.
Yeah, I love that, what you said.
You know? So John here is capturing this conversation.
Yeah.
And Jesus is saying, so, yo, man, first Nicodemus asks him, you truly are not of here. Nobody can be doing what you are doing and be not from God. How is it?
Yeah.
And Jesus says, to understand these things, you have to be born again. And this professor says, so how can you be born again?
Yeah.
How can you go back into your mother's womb and do this? And Jesus says, dude, man, you're a professor of all these things. You don't understand. What you have is intellectual knowledge. Your heart is not being transformed here. You need to be able to understand that this is more, I'm talking about spiritual things. These are not things. And then he gives the analogy. Check the wind. The wind goes from this way to that way. Do you know it comes? No. Do you know it goes here? So it is with those born of the Spirit. Okay?
Yeah.
So this was a mind-blowing thing. And he goes on to explain to them what it is to be born of the Spirit. And he summarizes this thing with the famous verse, for God so loved the world that he gave his only son. You see, that's the conversation that he has.
Yeah.
This was so mind-blowing for him.